So, Kate, great to see you again. Yeah, today I'd like to talk about higher education. I've been obviously in higher education on and off since 1992. I started in the administrative side, but I've been teaching as well ever since I got into it in 92. So that's like 30 years now. I can't believe it's 30 years has gone by. And just so I can legitimize some of the things that I'll be talking about today. My PhD at the University of Minnesota actually was in higher education. I'm very interested, obviously, in adult education, human transformation, human optimization, those kinds of things. And I remember back at the University of Minnesota when we were studying human learning and education, I had some of the greatest professors and influential people around me that really opened my eyes, I think, to some of the educational traditions that we just sort of take for granted and how it is that they can be questioned. And of course, I look at our system today. They used to talk about K-12 education and then higher education, but I really look at it today as K-16. I mean, it's K-16, right? And what we've had is a homogenization of educational practice across all of those the entire realm, right? So students today, when they graduate high school, they just assume that they're going to be going to college. They don't even think about the alternatives that might be available to them. I mean, some are arising today, and of course, the community college system has given a lot of people an opportunity to pursue higher education in a more localized fashion at lower cost, and I get that. But every single community college, I guarantee you, aspires to become a four-year institution, and most of them do, right? So they stay within the K-16 kind of mentality, and I have a lot of thoughts about the challenges that education is facing today, the new paradigms that need to be considered across the entire spectrum of K-16, and of course, as we are within, certainly this podcast is within the boundaries kind of the How to Be Intelligence book and the intellectual virtues. They certainly apply and can be applied in a very direct way to the way education is offered across the entire K-16. So, I've been fortunate to have that background, to not only have studied it as a PhD student and scholar, but also then to be in the domain of higher education for over 30 years. So that's kind of this perspective that I'll bring to our conversation today.
That's great. I want to hear so much more about so many of these things. So let's start with this reframing of not separating K through 12 in higher education, but really this K through 16 homogeneous pathway you're talking about. Let's start there, because then I think that'll introduce us into some of these paradigm changes that are happening.
Right. And so, it used to be when you got to be, you had your basic fundamental education in your K-12, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It needs to sort of have a basic understanding that enables you to communicate with the other people in your community. And in this case, the community is the entire nation of the United States, where we have a fairly standard curriculum at least, that was the idea of the common school. With Thomas Jefferson way back in the early part of the 19th century, believed that, America was going to always be kind of an agrarian society. The way to have people that were able to manage the government affairs was that everybody should be a fairly intelligent voter. Everybody should be able to rise up to the status of becoming, a representative of their districts or whatever. And so he pushed education out to all these rural areas, and it was basically called the Common School. And why is it called the Common School? Is because it had a common curriculum right across all of these, one-room schoolhouses and everything else that they used to have. And so that tradition, has evolved and become, and by the way, he really was kind of the founder of what we call public education, right? So that the government was actually involved in funding these institutions, and people everywhere would have access to the education that would make them good citizens, right? That was the whole idea of Jefferson. And you can think it's not a bad idea, right? But the whole, the background of that is to be acculturated to the civic traditions and so on of of our nation. And, and as we segued from that early agrarian society into a more industrialized society, people began to realize that, there were certain, pathways that you would go through as an adult by fitting into this industrialized structure. And so K-12 education became not just acculturation, but also sort of, if you will, preparing you for your vocation, right? So it became vocational education, not directly in the way of learning a trade, but rather preparing you to fit into the pre-existing structure of the industrialized society, right? Which of course then meant that you would learn the basics of, being on time at your desk, right? It's like punching the clock at the factory, sitting very quietly during the day and not disrupting, anything, going through the educational system according to very discrete, grade levels and so on, is almost as if this was like an innate part of human development, was that somehow or other, okay, I'm done with grade 4 and I'm ready for grade 5. It's like it's a natural part of some kind of developmental pathway that's innate in our DNA, which of course it's not. It's just something, this is a complete artificial development. And then, once it takes root and becomes institutionalized across the entire nation, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to change. And of course, there have been many, many people that have written against the sort of industrialized manner in which we teach our students, formerly as just K-12 and then today as K-16, including John Dewey and Piaget and many others who just said, look, it's not conducive to human development and creativity, and instead we become basically sort of cogs in this massive industrial machine, right? And yet at the same time, it's almost impossible for anybody to find the right language, the right scientific backing that would enable us to upset this entire infrastructure that has now been developed. And then, of course, over time, as the K-12 education system did, in fact, deliver people, generally speaking, when you're a high school graduate, for the most part of the 20th century, you were a good fit to go into the industrialized workplace and to find your way on a career path that would take you over a 40-year span to your to your end, right? Your golden your gold watch or whatever it is that they would say goodbye to you, and your pension plan and all that. And that became kind of, the Midwestern industrialized society. And the danger that we have when we talk about maybe that this paradigm needs to be reconsidered is that in fact it works, right? It does prepare people, once they leave high school. And of course, I'm talking about 20th century education, where high school education literally was enough to get into an industrialized kind of environment where you could then have a career path and continue, whatever kind of learning strategies you've developed in that K-12 framework. And of course, nobody ever talks in that K-12 framework about learning how to learn. You're just told what to learn. You're not told how it is that you go about that process, right? So that's totally not even discussed in typical K-12 education. And then as the universities, became founded, and the tradition of universities was to take these individuals that had, that basic acculturation, and to make them the transformers of society, to give them, to empower them in a way that was sort of, and I don't have the exact word for it, but they were supposed to be people that would look at society anew and freshen it constantly, right? And have the courage to go back and freshen things. And of course, in some cases, they did have professional education where, law schools and things like that were designed to just make you, a drone lawyer or whatever. But higher education, as it was originally conceived, was to make you a transformer of society after you had your basic acculturation, right? So this gave you access to new and challenging ideas and thoughts. And you would read the classics, and you would then develop the capacity to think in a more in-depth and expansive kind of a way, all at the same time, in-depth and expansive, all at the same time, and to see the broader picture and civilization as a whole, right? Well, over time, of course, that became criticized. Like, why should we learn Latin? And why should we learn the classics? Well, the classics are just a bunch of dead white men, and all this stuff. And eventually, people said, okay, well, I guess, the main purpose of higher education, and look at it. There isn't a higher education institution anywhere in this country that doesn't have a massive career office, right? So clearly what our goal is, rather than to help you become a transformer of society, it's to help you find a niche in the industrialized world in some higher managerial type capacity, overlording all those who quit at the 12th grade, right? So it's really K-16 now, and we have adopted all of the same practices of the traditional K-12. All we're doing is extending it into a little bit more ethereal realms of learning, if you will, higher levels of sophistication. But the students in my classrooms, I guarantee it, and I have nothing but juniors and seniors, right? They still learn only as much as they need to pass the exam and get the grade and get the credits so that they can graduate. And if you talk to them about, hey, do you have the courage to transform yourself? Do you have the courage to lead people and to lead transformation? They want no part of that. Generally speaking, one or two, in any class are going to be more, courageous. But generally speaking, it's become just get the grade, get the credit, get the degree, get a job.
So we went from higher ed's purpose being to transform society to conform into society. And that's where we are now. And you see a difference in your students.
And every now and then you still have some of the classical institutions that are able to have transformational faculty members that really challenge the students. But that's only at some of the best institutions where they still protect the faculty to be able to say what they want to say in the classroom. I can tell you right now, if I brought this lecture, for example, into a classroom and I started criticizing higher education, and especially some of all the ancillary things that are provided on most campuses today, which I think are just complete nonsense, all designed to coddle rather than challenge the American mind, I would probably get myself into some trouble, even though I'm a tenured faculty member. They would say to me, you may want to tone down that rhetoric because you're triggering some of these kids in, and that emotional, they don't want to have that emotional reaction to what it is that you're saying.
Let's talk about that for a minute. So what I've seen is a lot of shifts to business, bureaucrats, buildings. Higher ed is now focused on those administrative pieces. Yeah. Can you tell me more about what that means for being a professor, right? Because it changes the whole tenure track.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And, it used to, you go back to the origin of higher education was the Platonic salon, right? So here's Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. They basically just had salons where students would literally come to them and they would then have these challenging discussions and so on. And of course, people were transformed as a result of that, of having these conversations, including the professors were transformed by that. And of course, surrounding Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, there were massive amounts of staff and all kinds of offices to serve this, all the different needs of these students. They would literally come and it would be a little bit of a pilgrimage that they would be on, right? To try to transform themselves. So what's happened today, and I'll bring it into absolute reality. And we had a meeting of the entire College of Business, the first time we all got together since COVID began in several years. And I'm sitting there in this room, and there's probably about 80, 90 people in the room, and many of them I don't recognize because a lot of new hires have come in since COVID began. And I'm just looking around the room, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I see about 30 faculty in here, and if there's 90 people in here, that means that the ratio has now become about about 2 to 1. Or about a third of the paid full-time paid people in our college are faculty, and the rest are staff. And I'm thinking, what are all these people doing? And of course, every one of them has a salary. They're all expensive. They all have office space. They're all providing a justification for their existence by creating some type of new program or something like that suddenly becomes something we can't live without. And the conversations that we have when you get together as a group almost invariably center on staff and administrative kinds of issues, and nothing about how to become a more effective teacher. How do we become a more effective educational institution? How do we help our customers transform themselves into greater beings? And so we're constantly looking over our shoulders now as faculty, wondering who is keeping track of what we say and whether or not we're getting ourselves into trouble. And as you move on in your career, which unfortunately is the best part of your career, when you've really had some serious learning and some serious thought that you can now provide to people to help them transform, this is the time when you are most nervous about somebody objecting to what you have to say because you don't want to jeopardize your pending retirement. So you get more and more sort of internal to yourself and protective of the nest egg that you've been able to create in higher education. And you have these wise people with gray hair who have been through all kinds of intellectual challenges in their lives, not anymore able to share their perspectives because they're nervous about in any way jeopardizing their retirements.
Yeah, what a concept. That's totally true. I hadn't thought about it like that before.
Oh, absolutely.
So we've got the decline of the humanities. We've got these administrative costs that are skyrocketing. And really it's the students who feel that, right? So then what else? What else is like the paradigm shift that's happening here?
Well, the programs that are developed in higher education almost are always moving away from any kind of thing that's related to traditional education in terms of these are the books, these are the canonical books that used to help people transform themselves in the traditional Platonic, Socratic, kind of method of teaching. And they're being superseded now by books that, you look at even, I don't want to get into critical race theory and all that. I think there's a genuine argument there. As I see, K-16 education, I don't mind that K-12 is reading, writing, and arithmetic. I don't have a problem with that. I think civics needs to play a role as well. So, I think I get a big kick sometimes out of every now and then there's certain web-based media companies that'll go out and do interviews on campuses and stuff, and they'll ask, who's the vice president of the United States, and these college students sitting, they have no clue, right? They have no idea. So they don't have a civic education that keeps them engaged in the, in the nature of our governmental systems, right? The fact that we have a House of Representatives, we have a Senate, we have a judiciary, and we have the executive branch, right? People don't understand the dynamics of that. So they just vote according to things that have nothing to do with the policies that people are going to try to project into the world. So I don't mind that K-12 has that continuous, let's make you a good citizen. But I do believe that higher education needs to reclaim its original founding as the transformational space, where you have a certain period of time where you're no longer trying to acculturate. You know what that means to be able to read and to be able to manage your checkbook and all that kind of stuff. But now I need you to begin thinking about how do we transform the society and make it better. And of course, higher education will claim that it still does that, but if it's monolithic, that our basic founding principles are sound and valuable and laudable, and that we haven't lived up to that yet is just a function of where do we go from here, and how do we continue to transform and become a better country, more inclusive country, and without tearing down the past. But if I brought this lecture onto the campus, I would be shouted down, and I wouldn't have an opportunity to talk about let's recover our commitment to freedom, individual freedom. Let's recover our commitment to economic freedom, right, and political freedom. And let's really recognize how powerful that is in the history of humankind, to have a culture where the people are in charge of their government. Because you can see today what happens when the opposite is in fact in place. You have a dictator who literally, against the will probably of the people, if this was a referendum in Russia, I would bet you there would be 80-20 against invading Ukraine.
That's an interesting point, because you got to think about who's in college right now, or at university systems right now. Now, obviously, I work with high school students facing the decisions of going to college or not. And oftentimes they're not even eligible, first off, because they don't have the right kinds of classes. They don't have AP offerings. They don't have advanced science or math offerings to get into the programs that they want. But I also know extremely successful young people who have not gone to college. They are figuring it out. And when I ask them why don't they go, they say, well, I want to run a business. And if I could just take business classes, that'd be fine. I would be happy to go to college, but I have to take all of these other classes, and it's not worth my time or investment. I need to just hit the ground running and run my business. And honestly, out of like our closest friends, almost none of them have college degrees, and they are smart, brilliant people, and they're doing very well. So what do you have to say about that? And if you had children of college age, what would you recommend that they do right now?
Yeah, well, I certainly admire anybody who ends their formal education after the 12th grade, because I really, and I know many as well. So I have two thoughts on this. One is I admire those people, and in fact, those are exactly the kind of people that have recognized the same thing that I've recognized, that all they do if they go to college is get more of the same stuff that they had in high school, right? So why do it? Let's go and transform ourselves, transform society, build businesses, and create intergenerational wealth for my family. The second thing I would say for those who do go to college is take the bull by the horns. Don't let college become an extension of high school. You need to grasp your own education. You need to get into the library, read the stuff that you want to read. You need to create study groups that look at things that have nothing to do with getting an A in the classroom. As a matter of fact, I would recommend that you don't even strive for A's. I never did. My undergraduate GPA was 2.3, and I still got into graduate school. So you don't have to get good grades to be smart. You have to read a lot. You have to challenge yourself. You have to follow these intellectual virtues, and you can use the assets on a campus. It's like Steve Jobs. I mean, the wonderful speech that he gave at the Stanford graduation, where he says, the best thing I ever did was drop out and then drop in, right? So he dropped out of college, and because of the formal and expensive nature of everything, but then he dropped into the classes that he really wanted to study, like typography, which then was built into the Macintosh computer. And Steve Jobs doesn't have a college degree, and Bill Gates doesn't have you know the story of some of these entrepreneurs. So absolutely, if you go to college, think of it as you have now access to assets, libraries and speakers and music and art that you otherwise don't have access to. And this was for me when I went to, because my K-12, my K-16 education was pretty traditional. I didn't have the courage when I was in my early 20s to read my way through the library. When I got to graduate school and I discovered the beautiful libraries that they had at the University of Minnesota campus, I would literally spend my entire weekends just in the library, just grabbing stuff and reading and then buying books at the bookstore that I would be hunting through these old musty books and stuff. And it was like a discovery process. And I just learned the joy of engaging in my own development, you know? I did okay in graduate school because I'm a really good writer. And graduate school is mostly about writing, right? Not memorization like K-16. It's all memorization. And I tell my students, I'm not even going to give you an exam because I don't want you to memorize anything. I want this to be a meaningful thing for you. So you tell me how we're going to make this meaningful for you. Every one of my students has to come back to me with, here's what I'm going to do to make this meaningful. And I'll give an exam at the end of the semester, but I don't really take much stock in that. It's more for me to see whether or not anybody has picked up a little bit of something from my class, right? But the grade comes from their demonstration of their willingness to engage in this material and to try to transform themselves. That's how I give my grades.
Well, we might have to do a second part on this because I think there's a lot more to discuss. But thank you.
I could go on about higher education forever.
We're not even skimming the surface. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's make a second part to this.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. Just the willingness to engage in the material, that right there, you know, your willingness to transform yourself. That's how you're evaluated. That to me is the takeaway from today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.